But because we speak the language, we understand what each of us is saying. The word dog, for instance, is a monosyllabic grunt if you don't speak English. But if you do speak English, you see, by using your imagination, the image of a four-legged canine, right? So the point is that we cannot even speak to each other or to ourselves because we think with words. Every single word is an allegory. It's something which points beyond itself to something else. That allegorical leap from the word, either written or spoken, is a leap of the imagination. So it's absolutely foundational, not just to who we are, but to our very existence. We cannot think or be or communicate without using our imagination.
Mr. Joseph Pearce, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure's all mine. So jumping straight into the first question, how big was the impact that G.K. Chesterton had on your life?
It could hardly be larger, actually. I always say that under grace, obviously to give God the glory, but under grace, Chesterton was the biggest single influence upon my conversion. So I was a very angry young man, a very long way from Christ, very anti-Catholic. But it was through the reading of Chesterton that basically I was brought to the Catholic faith. And so under grace, he's the biggest single influence. So my first book as a Catholic was my biography of Chesterton, and I always say that was an act of thanksgiving, actually a twofold act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God.
What is it about Chesterton that you think had such a big impact on you?
Well, a couple of things, I think, or a few things, but one, I was raised, as I think most people in our culture are, to believe you have to choose between faith or reason. You can be religious, but you can only be religious by abandoning reason. So you can have the comforts of religion by basically living a lie, or you can genuflect before reason and accept the fact that there's no God and there's no comfort, and we're all living in an age of existential despair and despondency, and just get used to it. But what Chesterton showed me was actually that faith and reason are not opposites or enemies, but on the contrary, they're wedded in an indissoluble marriage. The Catholic Church always puts them together, fides et ratio, faith and reason, that we are not called to believe anything which is irrational. And indeed, reason properly pursued, in other words, with humility and not with pride, leads us to a belief in God. And then we start asking fundamental questions such as, if God does exist, could he reveal himself? Well, yes. And would he reveal himself? Well, he seems to have done so. And then you take it from there. So it's a rational process. So Chesterton, first of all, taught me this indissoluble union between faith and reason. He gets that, of course, from the Catholic Church in general, and from great philosophers such as St. Thomas Aquinas in particular, of whom he wrote a book, on whom he wrote a book. But also, I loved his sense of humor. I loved the juxtaposition of humor and humility. That basically, I said that the reason that Chesterton was so powerful is he spent his life on his knees, but he also, at the end of orthodoxy, the one great secret that Christ did not reveal is his mirth, right? His sense of humor. So, when we look at who we are as the imago Dei, made in the image of God, it means the way we discern that is, well, how are we different from the other creatures? Because obviously we have certain biological functions and appetites and desires that we share with other creatures. But the ability to reason abstractly, to work out how far the sun is from us, how long light takes to get here from the sun, is something which is singular. So reason is something part of the imago Dei. Goodness, in other words, to recognize virtue and to practice virtue by laying down our lives for others, is this act of love. So love and reason, and then creativity, creation. Unlike any other creature, we can create. God's a creator, and he gives us creativity ourselves to create things, or sub-create, as Tolkien would say. But the fourth, which is often overlooked, we often talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful, as we should. But the fourth is laughter, right? no other creature laughs. It's something which is singular and human. And I think Chesterton understands that. And therefore, if humor and laughter are part of the Imago Dei, the image of God in us, then clearly that is something that Christ, when he was walking this earth, chose to not reveal, that it is this great secret, the secret of the mirth of God, of God's sense of humor. I think Chesterton says in his poem, the Skeleton, that death is but the good king's jest. So so I think so. That's a humor, humility, paradox. His use of paradox changed my life. An apparent contradiction that points to a deeper truth. That I began to perceive things paradoxically. Ronald Knox said that Chesterton's paradoxes became the platitudes of our thought. Speaking of his generation, a century ago, and it was true of me. That basically Chestertonian paradox became my platitudes.
Beautiful. So in Orthodoxy, right at the beginning, Chesterton talks about this relationship that reason has to the individual, and he talks about how, the madman's the man who only has reason. And when I read that, that made me realize, in the world today, we almost elevate reason to a god, right? And historically, that's also happened. So I always get the sense when I go through Orthodoxy that Chesterton is also trying to sort of counterbalance something with reason. It's not that we dispose of reason, but it needs to be counterbalanced with, I would say, mystery, and paradox falls into that. But I would also say imagination. I'm just curious, as somebody who's studied a lot of Chesterton and read a lot of Chesterton, what do you think the role, or how do you think Chesterton viewed the imagination? What is the role of the imagination to a Chestertonian?
Well, the key thing, first of all, to avoid heresy, finding ourselves in Chesterton's book Heretics, should he be able to write one from beyond the grave? We don't want to be in it. The good, the true, and the beautiful are indissoluble. Also, they are triune. So even mystery is not irrational. It's beyond our ability to see it, which is not the same thing as it being irrational. So I think it was Ronald Knox that says that mysticism begins in mist and ends in schism. Um, of course, all mysticism doesn't, but mysticism, if it's not going to end in schism and error and heresy, has to be subject to orthodoxy. In other words, it has to be subject to reason. So there is a sense in which the way I sometimes try to explain this is using the metaphor of a dog. So imagine that the dog has a limited understanding. His owner, when its owner comes home, it gets excited because it might get fed and it might be taken for a walk, right? So it knows there's a connection. Its reason can work out there's a connection between the owner coming home and these good things that might happen thereafter. If the owner then, instead of taking the dog out for a walk or feeding the dog, sits down and picks up a paper and opens the newspaper, the dog, using its reason, its canine reason, will know that, well, I'm not going to be going for a walk or being fed until he puts that paper down. Knows that from experience. So he settles down in the corner and sulks or whatever. So, but what the dog can never do, ever, is read the paper. Right. So there are some things that transcend and are beyond our human capacity to know. They're within the logos, the reason himself, God. They're not irrational. It's just that they're beyond our reach.
Mm.
I
So
want to ask you a question about the imagination. So let me now do that. Sorry, I wanted to make sure that we're not going to separate the good, the true, and the beautiful from each other, or prioritize one over the other. They're triune. But the imagination is again the imago Dei in us. It's the imago Dei in us that allows us to be creative, to be like the Creator Himself through using our own creative capacities. So the imagination is the imagination, and we cannot even. So it's not just artists and storytellers and composers that need the imagination. Scientists need the imagination. If you can't think outside the box, you do not innovate, right? You do not see new things. So the imagination is a crucial faculty for human persons to be part of that divine attribute or bringing new things into being. Now, Tolkien would and Chesterton would certainly have agreed that Tolkien would distinguish between creation and subcreation. Creation is what God does. It brings things into being ex nihilo, from nothing. We can't do that. We don't have that ability. But what we can do is to subcreate, to use Tolkien's terminology. We bring things into being from other things that already exist. So, a landscape artist will take a canvas, watercolors or oils, an easel, paintbrushes, oils or watercolors, his eyes, his hands, the landscape, buildings, light, all these things that exist already, but create something new, this landscape painting, from things that already exist. And he could use his imagination and think, this landscape's beautiful, but it would look even better if I put a couple of cows over there, even though they're not there. And using his artistic license, but he's not creating the cows. He knows what a cow is from seeing them elsewhere, but he's putting them into this picture to make it original.
So the imagination assists in it's essentially a part of our identity as human beings. It's what allows us to contribute to God's creation, in a sense, in a more effective way.
It's necessary. I mean, let me give an example, a primary example. What we're doing now is making a series of noises. If we don't speak English, we would be just making a series of meaningless noises. But because we speak the language, we understand what each of us is saying. But the word dog, I seem to have dogs on my mind today. The word dog, for instance, is a monosyllabic grunt if you don't speak English. But if you do speak English, you see, by using your imagination, the image of a four-legged canine, right? So the point is that we cannot even speak to each other or to ourselves because we think with words. Every single word is an allegory. It's something which points beyond itself to something else. That allegorical leap from the word, either written or spoken, is a leap of the imagination. So it's absolutely foundational, not just to who we are, but to our very existence. We cannot think or be or communicate without using our imagination.
Okay, perfect. So, in your deep studies of Chesterton, is there something that you discovered that surprised you about him?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that that surprised me about Chesterton is the fact that I'm always being surprised by Chesterton. So, for instance, I mean, let me take one example. Probably, if you force me to choose my favorite of all Chesterton books, because I'm a literature person, I would gravitate towards one of his literary work. I mean, all of his works are literary because he's such a literary writer, but one of his works of fiction. And I love The Ball and the Cross, but I think my favorite is probably The Man Who Was Thursday. And I've taught The Man Who Was Thursday on numerous occasions. I've lost count, and I've written about it many times. But every time I return to it, I discover something new within it. And it's not a particularly long book. I mean, how many times do you have to read something and teach something and write about something before you've exhausted it? Well, I mean, what surprises me about a book like The Man Who Was Thursday, it seems to be inexhaustible, which is a paradox because it's a finite object with a finite number of words, and yet that every time I return to it, I discover new things.
The last chapter in The Man Who Was Thursday, I think I had to reread that probably 3 times and then get a commentary to assist me through it because it becomes so symbolic that it's difficult to carry through. What was? Can you recall what it was like for you reading that chapter for the first time?
Well, I was completely both enthralled and baffled.
Yeah.
And I think that everybody reads the Man Who Was Thursday for the first time if they do it outside of the context of a classroom. And even then you have to rely on the person teaching it knowing what they're talking about. But on the assumption that they do, you're being guided. But if you read it recreationally, you read it for fun by yourself. Nobody's read that novel and understood it first time round. Nobody. And that's why it invites. It's a mystery novel in the best sense of the word, and it's mystery novel in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's detective fiction. there's a crime, or at least there's a criminal, or is there? So the point is that it's a mystery story where the actual mystery is not a particular specific crime, an event that needs to be solved. It's the mystery is the mystery itself, and the mystery itself being God, and the mystery of suffering, and the connection between the mystery of suffering and God. I mean, these are huge topics, and Chesterton just he takes us on a to go from the sublime to the core blimey, as we say in London. That take us on a Beatles like magical mystery tour, right? That's what he does. We go into it, and it seems surreal, and there are aspects of the novel. I mean, it predates surrealism, but C.S. Lewis compared The Man Who Thursday to Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. And he basically says that Chesterton goes deeper into the mystery and doesn't just, should we say, wallow or lose himself in despondency within the mystery, making it a nightmare. He actually goes beyond that to show us some meaning and purpose within the mystery, and that makes him. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but people get my biography of Chesterton and look up Kafka in the index, they can get the exact quote from Lewis. But basically, Chesterton goes much deeper than Kafka, and this predates surrealism. But what it does, it unites realism with surrealism. Not surrealism as an escape from reality, an escape from the real to the dream, right? Something which is subreal. But on the contrary, taking the dream, taking the mystery and the imagination and the weird, and finding meaning there. So realism and surrealism, if you like, wedded in a wonderful work of fiction.
Yeah, it's an incredible book, and I actually think it's underappreciated by a lot of Chesterton fans because, okay, maybe not necessarily Chesterton fans, but people that want to get into Chesterton. I think initially they just want to go to Orthodoxy or Everlasting Man. I would encourage anyone listening to this to really consider reading The Man Who Was Thursday, because it's everything you described, but additionally, there's also these moments of genius throughout. I'm reminded of the moment where they're in Saffron Park right at the beginning, and the anarchist and I believe he's disguised as a police officer. They're having this little debate, and the anarchist is saying, "Look at the tree. It's so jagged and free, and it's not limited by order." And then he says, "Look at the street light, and it's so rigid and direct, and it's so constrained by its structure." And then the other guy says something so beautiful. He says, "Yeah, but you can only see the tree by the light of the lamp. I doubt you'll see the lamp by the light of the tree." But anyway, I just wanted to add that. Highly recommend Man Who Was Thursday.
Yeah, I think what he actually says, what Gabriel Simon actually says, is that I don't think it's a doubt. Is that I wonder whether we would ever see the lamp by the light of the tree. And again, this is just one example. You've taken one line. And it is true that, of course, after dark, we need perhaps technology to see better, although that technology can just be a candle or a fire. But it is true that we don't really understand technology and science unless we can see it through the lens of beauty. So it is true in some sense that we understand the lamp better if we can see it by the light of the tree. And Tolkien would certainly agree with that. So, there's a whole point that you can get deeper and deeper and deeper into the mystery. One of the important things about The Man Who Was Thursday, as we've been talking about orthodoxy, and this is key for people who want to go deeper. Orthodoxy and The Man Who Was Thursday were written in 1908. In other words, they were written at about the same time. And you talk about seeing the lamp by the light of the tree, or the tree by the light of the lamp. We need to see The Man Who Was Thursday by the light of orthodoxy. And indeed, the other way around, we need to see orthodoxy by the light of The Man Who Was Thursday. The two works are being written around the same time. He's just using two different modes, non-fiction and fiction, to try to bring people to a deeper understanding of reality.
Wow, I had no idea. I'd never actually looked at the years, and I knew. I think Orthodoxy said 1908, right?
Yeah, and Man Who Was Thursday also 1908. Yeah,
1908. Wow. Okay. So, if you had to choose just one, Orthodoxy or Everlasting Man, as a favorite between the two kind of big names, which one would you would you say is your favorite?
That's very, very difficult. The, the chapter 4 in Orthodoxy, the Ethics of Elfland, might be my favorite chapter of prose in non-fictional prose in any of Chesterton. So that might tip it in that direction. But really, The Everlasting Man was very important to my conversion. Well, both those books are very important to my conversion. But Chesterton's understanding of the outline of history is crucial. I mean, the background of that book, as I'm sure you know, is H.G. Wells's The Outline of History, and that this is an atheistic, philosophically materialistic understanding of history, where basically we're moving forward. Science is going to deliver us from the primitive past and from superstition and religion, which are the same thing, in Wells's viewpoint, to this golden age, this utopia in the future brought about by science. H.G. Wells dies just after World War II, in the shadow of the atomic bomb and the beginning of the Cold War. And his final book, significantly, is The Mind at the End of Its Tether. In other words, he's become disillusioned with his own philosophical optimism. He's proved himself, or history has proved his own understanding of history wrong before he even dies. But the point is, Hilaire Belloc writes a companion to Mr. Wells' Outline of History. Wells, wanting to get the last word, writes a book called Mr. Belloc Objects, to answer Belloc's objections. And then Belloc, who did get the last word, wrote a book called Mr. Belloc Still Objects. Right, so you have this back and forth, and Belloc claimed to have written over 100,000 words in refutation of Wells. But it was somewhat bellicose, Bellocian bellicosity, sometimes a lack of charity. The Everlasting Man is Chesterton's contribution to that discussion about what is the outline of history. But he does it not with Bellocian bellicosity, but with Chestertonian charity. And that's he only mentions H.G. Wells, I think, twice. It's not a direct rebuttal, but he's basically showing an alternative way of understanding history, where the incarnation makes all the difference. And he's brilliant debunking of chronological snobbery. My favorite chapter in the whole of The Everlasting Man is the first, The Man in the Cave. Where he basically shows that all the evidence we have of our primitive ancestors is not that they murdered their wives and were barbarics. The only evidence we actually have is art. And he says art is the signature of man. In other words, the only evidence we have about our ancient Neolithic or caveman ancestors is the fact they are very similar to us. They use the imagination to make beautiful things. I love both books. If you force me to choose, I would probably say Orthodoxy.
I would say the same. Why Ethics of Elfland? It's my favorite too, but I'd just love to hear your take. Why is it? Why do you say it's your favorite?
Well, it's profoundly impacted what I call my understanding of the philosophy of myth. It was also that chapter is also hugely influential upon on C.S. Lewis's understanding of the philosophy of myth, and on J.R.R. Tolkien's understanding of the philosophy of myth. So, if you like, on that foundation, we have Narnia, we have Middle Earth. So, Chesterton's contribution to 20th century culture is enormous on the basis of that one chapter alone. So, although it also impacted me in the same way, obviously, I'm a minnow beside minnow in a small pond beside Tolkien and Lewis. And speaking of which, by the way, that Lewis, apart from being hugely influenced by the Ethics of Elfland, he was reading of the Everlasting Man that definitively brought him back to a belief in God. He said that in reading the Everlasting Man, I saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me for the first time in a way that made sense. So the reading of the Everlasting Man was crucial in Lewis's return to belief in God. He didn't become a Christian until a few years later, and Tolkien was influential upon Lewis's embrace of Christianity, but Chesterton certainly brought him back in that direction. And very interesting as regards the Everlasting Man as well. So the Everlasting Man brings Lewis back to God. When a young Jewish girl in New York, um, when she was a teenager, first read The Outline of History by H.G. Wells, she instantaneously became, having read it, instantly became an atheist. She would later become a communist. Um, the, that person would later start reading the works of C.S. Lewis, and eventually would become C.S. Lewis's wife, having before that become a Christian. This person is Joy Davidman, some known as Joy Gresham or Joy Lewis, after she married Mrs. C.S. Lewis, shall we say. So the Everlasting Man not only brings Lewis to the faith, but actually repairs the damage H.G. Wells's book did in turning someone into an atheist. By bringing her back indirectly by impacting other people. In other words, this is all part of a living culture. When I wrote my book, Literary Converts, someone I interviewed, a friend of Dorothy Sayers, said that the Catholic cultural revival in the 20th century was a network of minds and a network of grace, a network of minds influencing each other. So there's this network. So Chesterton writes this book that impacts Lewis, and Lewis then impacts Joy Davidman and brings Joy Davidman back from a negative impact that H.G. Wells had. It's a network. We're part of living culture.
How did Chesterton influence Tolkien?
Well, again, there's lots of there's lots of smaller indirect evidence, and then there's the bigger picture. Let me begin with the smaller evidence. So Tolkien was born in 1892. His mother is received into the church. He loses his father, actually, in South Africa. He dies in South Africa, Tolkien's father, before returning back home to England with the rest of the family. So Tolkien's mother brings the two boys, Tolkien and his brother, up alone, and she becomes a Catholic in 1900. She has both of her sons received into the church. So I sometimes say that Tolkien is not a convert or a cradle Catholic. He's a cradle convert, sort of somewhere between the two, because he's about 8 when he becomes a Catholic. But it was 1900 was also the year when G.K. Chesterton was first published. And in terms of cultural impact, it's probably true to say that Chesterton was most widely read and most widely influential between 1900, when he basically exploded onto the scene, became hugely popular with his daily newspaper columns almost immediately, started writing books almost immediately, through to the start of World War One. So it's 1900 to 1914. And although Chesterton had not been formally received into the church, delaying because he didn't want to take that step without his wife Frances taking the step with him. So he procrastinated. But to all intents and purposes, Chesterton had been a Catholic for many years. And certainly he was very widely read and widely loved by England's Catholics. So that period from 1900 to 1914 is the period when Tolkien is from 8 up to when he's 22. So this period of formation. And we know that Tolkien read many of Chesterton's books. He was very influenced. His imagination was very influenced by The Ballad of the White Horse. And this along with things such as the Norse sagas, baptizing, if you like, Tolkien's imagination with the spirit of the North. But he obviously read many other works. When he died, his library contained numerous works by Chesterton. He in his seminal lecture essay on fairy stories, he talks about Chestertonian fantasy as being very important. So we could carry on forever. Tolkien's understanding of the Shire is very similar to Chesterton's understanding of the Shire. And as we've said, the ethics of Elfland, that chapter for orthodoxy, was crucial in baptizing Tolkien's imagination and helping develop the philosophy of myth. And again, Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton never used myth in the negative modern sense of being a lie. A myth, if in actual etymological sense from the Greek, it just means story. So the philosophy of myth is philosophia, the love of wisdom to be found in stories, right? And so that's why Tolkien says that Christianity is the true myth, not a true lie, which would be a contradiction in terms, but it's the true story. It's the story which is told with facts and not with words. It's the story which is creation and not sub-creation, right? That God is bringing the being from nothing with facts rather than the stories we're telling with words. So this understanding of the gospel and of history itself, the whole of history is, history is his story, God's story, that Tolkien was very, very, very strong on. He got, at least in large part, from Chesterton.
So, speaking of Tolkien, perhaps we could focus in on a little bit on Lord of the Rings. Why do you think there is this reluctance to sort of accept or acknowledge the Catholicity of the Lord of the Rings?
Well, certainly, the the Lord of the Rings is the most popular book of the 20th century. In fact, it's probably behind only Don Quixote as regards the best-selling work of literature of all time. So, and unlike Don Quixote, which has been around for 400 years, this is still within its first century of life. So it's enormously popular, which means it's popular not just amongst Christians, not just amongst Catholics, but amongst atheists, agnostics, and all sorts of people. And of course, if they love the Lord of the Rings and they're attracted by it, and they know there's something deep and good in it, which they want to return to, they don't want to be told that, well, the thing that's good and deep you want to return to is actually a Catholic understanding of the cosmos. That's obviously going to be something which is threatening to them, which is why there's this resistance. But the facts from the text, the facts from what Tolkien has written about the Lord of the Rings himself, extra textually, from talking about the text, makes it perfectly clear. I mean, the one quote, I'm quoting Tolkien word for word here. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So, I mean, you can't get more brazenly stating the case than that. And for Tolkien, it's not just a fact; it's obvious, of course, as he would say.
Coming to the end of the interview now, I have one final question for you, which is I'm sort of asking this a bit tongue in cheek, but how much did you enjoy the Rings of Power?
Well, I've enjoyed them very much because I haven't watched them. I'm sure that I'd have enjoyed it much less if I had. Unlike many people, I quite enjoy. In fact, not quite enjoy. I do very much enjoy Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. There are things wrong with them, of course. If I put my purist hat on, I can give you a list of things are wrong as long as my arm. But if I remove my purist hat, just put my movie lover's hat on, and I just allow it to wash over me, and allow the element of poetic license that was used, I can thoroughly enjoy those. Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies are horrible, quite clearly and ironically. That Peter Jackson was suffering from the dragon sickness when he did the Hobbit movie. He becomes Smaug. I mean, that's Tolkien's last laugh, I think. But the Rings of Power take things even further because they're quite clearly not even having any real pretense at keeping with either the letter or the spirit of Tolkien's work. So I decided that I was not going to watch them, and I have met people that enjoy them, including people whose judgment I trust. But I've also met many other people that basically say that they're horrible. And of course, the other thing about them, if they're going to carry on, they're going to get worse. That's the way things are. That even if there are things about in the first series which are okay, second series will be worse. Not just in terms of artistic quality, and that's inevitably what happens, but also in terms of not even keeping any pretense. Apart from the fact that elves and dwarves running around, there'll be no connection to Tolkien whatsoever.
Yeah, I tried watching one episode, and I actually did watch one episode, and then I just had no impetus to keep going. I would much rather dedicate that time to reading the actual books or watching the Peter Jackson films.
Well, you and I are on exactly the same page, or exactly the same DVD where that's concerned. Yes.
So, Mr. Pearce, thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely speaking with you. I've learned so much. Just for the audience's sake, if someone watched this and they thought, wow, this is really interesting, I really enjoyed listening to this gentleman, I'd really like to learn more about him, find his work, where would you direct people?
Yeah, the easiest way to keep up with what I'm doing is just to go to my website, which is updated most days. It's jpearce.co. Very easy, jpearce.co.
Perfect. And there will be links in the description, and I'll also put that up on the screen so you guys watching should have already seen that. Mr. Pearce, thank you again for your time, and God bless you. Thank you for the work you're doing. Please keep doing what you're doing.
My pleasure, and keep up the good work you're doing. It's good to see new kids on the block doing wonderful things. So God bless you.